Women's Suffrage by Samuel Novotny. Women's suffrage is one of the most important movements in this nation's history. This movement helped to give over half of the United States population a vote and a voice. There were many important women that worked hard and fought for this right, and their history is extremely important to the overall history of the nation. The history of this movement was not short. It started in the mid-19th century and continued through 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The nation celebrated the 100th year anniversary of this on April 18, 2020, and although 100 years may seem like a long time, it is astonishing that women have only had this right for 100 years. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines suffrage as the right of voting, along with the exercise of that right. This is why movement is described as women's suffrage. It is the movement to give women the right to exercise their vote. This is something that democracy leans on heavily. The right to vote is what keeps the democracy running smoothly, and giving as many individuals as possible in the democracy the right to vote is one of the most important parts of ensuring a solid democracy. While suffrage is important in America, it was also a big movement in places such as Europe, Canada, and Australia, with World War I being a big turning point for many of these countries in terms of women's suffrage. It is weird now to think that women could not vote just 100 years ago, but that was really the reality, and that is why this movement was so vital for the improvement of democracy in America. The beginning of this movement starts in the Wesleyan Chapel of Seneca Falls, New York. The convention was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were abolitionists who had met prior in 1840 at an anti-slavery convention in London. Them, along with Martha Wright, Mary Ann McClintock, and Jane Hunt, sent out a call for the conference. In the Seneca County Courier, they published an announcement for a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious rights of women. The dates were set for July 19th and 20th of 1848. This was the beginning of a movement that these women aspired to create, with the end goal to achieve equal opportunity no matter the gender. The convention began on July 19th with 200 women in attendance. Here Stanton read off the Declaration of Sentiments and Grievances, which she had modeled over the previous few days by the Declaration of Independence, including a line in which she states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." This was a strong statement by Stanton for the whole of the convention, as she was speaking for all of these women and saying they are no less than any man. The second day was open to anybody, and about 40 men did show up, most notably abolitionist Frederick Douglass. On this day, the Declaration was signed and adopted, and 12 resolutions were adopted. This convention was followed by 2 weeks later, in Rochester, New York, another convention, followed by an annual convention in the coming years. The picture on the left is the Declaration after being signed, and the drawing on the right would be Stanton reading it off on that first day. Susan B. Anthony is one of the biggest names from the women's suffrage movement. She was born in 1820 and passed in 1906, so she never lived to see the finality of women's suffrage, but her voice was one of the most important for many years. Anthony did not attend the Seneca Falls Convention, but she did meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1951, sparking years of friendship and unity. The two founded the American Equal Rights Association, and in 1968 became editors of the association's newspaper to spread ideas of equality for women. She was arrested in 1872 for voting and was fined $100 for this violation. She was very opposed to the 14th and 15th Amendments ratification, as they gave African Americans the right to vote, but not women, which separated her and Stanton from many other suffragists. In 1888, she helped to merge the two large suffrage organizations into the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which she then led until 1900. She was a truly spectacular voice for women's rights and suffrage. The 1900s is when the women's suffrage movement really began to blossom and gain traction towards a fix. The organizations of the late 1800s and early 1900s were there to get the right to vote, but they also wanted economic, social, and political reform. This was seen in women's jobs during the time period. From 1880 to 1910, The number of employed women went from 2.6 to 7.8 million. Although in 1900, 60% of the women who were employed as domestic servants. This improvement shows that women began to gain respect in the economy as they were able to get more jobs, yet they were not getting the high-end jobs like the men just yet. World War I landed right in the height of the women's suffrage movement. Lasting from 1914 to 1918, this was a pivotal moment in time for women in the world. With the men at war, many women were left to pick up everything that had been dropped when many men left for the war. One of the biggest fields that women stepped into around the world, and in America, was science. Because many men were abroad, women that were still left in the nation stepped in, proving that they had been ready for real work and could do it well. This in general was a great time for women not only to step into the workforce, but to prove that they can accomplish any task a man can. The 19th Amendment is the end goal of all of these suffragist movements of the time. They wanted to obtain equal right and opportunity, and the best way to begin that is with the right to vote. This process began in 1878 when it was first introduced to Congress, but it was not ratified until 1920, meaning the process was quite long. There were many different ways that this process was approached, until the final ratification ended the whole process in 1920. This was really only the beginning for women's equality, but it was a giant leap for suffragist organizations. There were some attempts in between the introduction of the amendment and the ratification that would have made an amendment unnecessary, although obviously none of these were fully successful. The easiest way to bypass an amendment here would be to go state through state legislation, because if every state allows women to vote, then the national government does not need to take any action. By 1912, 9 states had adopted suffrage legislation, and some others challenged voting laws in courts. There were protests to try to give women a voice, but eventually the conclusion was come to that this would not be enough, and the amendment was going to be needed. By 1916, the women's suffrage movement as a whole realized that these attempts would not be good enough, so they united for the goal of a constitutional amendment, one that had been proposed 38 years prior. In 1917, New York adopted women's suffrage. It was a huge step because all previous states to adopt it had been in the West, and President Woodrow Wilson changed his stance to support women's suffrage in 1918. This was a true turning point that had been created during this time. In 1919, the House and Senate both passed the amendment within 2 weeks of each other, and they had just needed a 3/4 majority of states to ratify the amendment for it to be complete. In August 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify, and the amendment was passed. The 19th Amendment was a huge milestone for women's suffrage organizations, and was truly an end goal for some of them. But this amendment does not mean women were treated equally. At this time, there were still poll taxes and poll quizzes that could hinder one's ability to vote, especially if a woman had not been formally educated as a child. African American women still could not vote, as the civil rights movement had not given them the right to vote at this point. This amendment gives women the right to vote, but their status in society remained mostly the same. The fight for equal rights is one that is still being fought by women today, 100 years after the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The civil rights movement gave all women the right to vote, no matter their race, and over the last 50 years, women have taken a much larger role in the workplace. While women have been included in the workplace more, they still are generally given lower-level jobs and paid less than the men around them, showing there is still lots of room for improvement. Women's suffrage is important for a number of reasons. Women are a majority in our society, so them having the right to voice their opinion is vital. Women also add to our society, as they are often brighter and harder working than the average man, giving great value, making it a no-brainer to promote equality. Suffrage is also vital to democracy. If a huge amount of the population cannot vote, then a democracy is not really true to itself. A democracy needs to hear the voices of all of its people, especially for women. The women's suffrage movement has forever changed the landscape of the nation politically, socially, and in terms of equality. The movement of women's suffrage could be capped off in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Yet in reality, the fragments of that movement remain in today's world. Women still fight for equality every day, and that fight will probably not be over for a long time. The best thing that can be done for women is to have their backs. The women of today's world cannot obtain equality alone, so supporting equality is one of the best things somebody can do today, so that hopefully one day equality can truly be reached. In conclusion, women's suffrage was a long and tiring process. The biggest step was ratifying the 19th Amendment in 1920, ending the suffrage movement, but opening a world of possibilities for women in the world. Alice Stone Blackwell, a highly notable suffragist, said in 1914, "The struggle has never been a fight of woman against man, but always of broad-minded men and women on one side against narrow-minded men and women on the other." Blackwell is saying that the open-minded are always fighting the narrow-minded, and the suffrage movement opened so many people's minds to the ability of women. This forever changed the history of America just 100 years ago, and since that day in 1920, women have fought for equal right and opportunity. The greatest example of this being Kamala Harris, breaking the boundary of highest-ranking woman in the United States government. For the citations, we have a JSTOR article about women in World War I, specifically scientists. Second is another JSTOR article about what is not known about the women's suffrage movement mostly. The third was used for a quote from Alice Stone Blackwell. The fourth is from the National Archives about the 19th Amendment. Fifth is from the Library of Congress that just talks about a lot of the statistics and numbers from women in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Sixth is from History.com about the Seneca Falls Convention. Seventh is from the National Women's History Museum about Susan B. Anthony. And the eighth is just from Merriam-Webster Dictionary about suffrage. Thanks.